A gute Woche. Today's Farbrengen was, as it's obvious from the Sichos, Farbrengen was tied in with the fact that yesterday was Beis Iyar, 2 days in the month of Iyar, which is the birthday, the Yom Haledes of the Rebbe Maharash, who was born on Beis Iyar, or as it is referred to by Chassidim also, Antiferes Shebetiferes, which this is how the Sphira is. In the counting of the Sphira, Beis Iyar is the Sphira of Tiferes Shebetiferes. Before we go into the Sichos, today's Farbrengen was a little bit different than usual in the arrangement of the Sichos and the way the Rebbe speaks the Sichos. Usually, the Rebbe, in the Shabbos Farbrengens, the way it's usually, he speaks 2 Sichos at the beginning of the Farbrengen, and the third Sicha is usually a Maimer, contents of a Maimer. And then after the third Sicha, that is when the Rebbe begins with the Rashi and the Rambam, Pirkei Avos, and all the other inyanim. Today it was different, that right away in the first Sicha, the latter part of the first Sicha, the Rebbe already said the Maimer. In fact, when he began to speak the second Sicha, he said that he made a change today different than usual, and we already spoke the Maimer, so really we could continue on right away to the Rashi and to the Rambam L'Kutei Yitzchak as we usually do. But nonetheless, he did speak another Sicha before he went into it, another Sicha that has to do with Rashi, not in particular with Rashi in this week's Chazarah, but a general lineage that has to do with Rashi in several places in Chumash. Okay, now let us go through a little bit, a couple the Nekudos, what was discussed in the Farbrengen. The Rebbe began the Farbrengen that we all know with the Chazal tell us, Misha Torach be'erev Shabbos, yochal b'Shabbos. The one who prepares on Erev Shabbos, he's the one that has what to eat on Shabbos. In other words, we have to prepare on Friday so that we should have on Shabbos. Same applies naturally in the spiritual sense. We prepare Friday, the spiritual level, for Shabbos. Now this Friday was a Friday of special significance because it is the birthday of the Rebbe Maharash. And regarding a birthday, the Rebbe says, it says in Yerushalmi that one on his birthday, it is Mazloi Goiver. His Mazel gains strength on his birthday, on his date of birth. Memele, it is the Mazloi Goiver of the Rebbe Maharash. And the Rebbe Maharash, it is known, one of his most famous inyanim, which he related, one of his most famous instructions, is the inyan of Lekatchila Ariba. As the Rebbe Maharash expressed himself in Yiddish, the Welt sagt, the world says, as mekenish darunter geht men ariba, if one can't go under, then he goes over. And he continued, in Ich Zog, the Rebbe Maharash says that the approach of a person has to be Lekatchila Ariba. The Rebbe, at many occasions, refers to this quotation of the Rebbe Maharash, which actually means that we have to go above and beyond. The Rebbe Maharash instructs us that in any matter which we come across, any matter which we deal, our approach has to be such of Lekatchila Ariba, above and beyond. We have to not first try to go under. If we're not successful by going under, then we go over and above, but our approach should be such that initially our reaction should be to everything in a broad way, in a broad manner of above and beyond. And the Rebbe explained today that the expression of the Rebbe Maharash is, first he tells us what the Welt says, what the world says. That the attitude of the world is, oh, when do we go Ariba? Am mekenish darunter geht man Ariba. And then he tells us what the Rebbe Maharash says. And ich sag Lekatchila Ariba. So the Rebbe asks, why does the Rebbe Maharash have to explain all of this and elaborate and tell us what the world says. Welt, world, is olam. Olam, Hasidus teaches us, stems from the word of Helem. In other words, world is a cover-up on godliness. So why is it necessary for the Rebbe Marash to tell us what is the view of the world? Which obviously this is not the Torah view. This is a view which originates in Olam, Miloshen Helem. In other words, where godliness is not obvious and is not seen, but it is covered. He could have related his instruction to us that instruction of the Rebbe Marash is that an attitude of a Yid is to be that in all his inyanim it should be like a Tchila Rebbe. So the Rebbe explains that by this the Rebbe Marash is stressing that even the worldly matters which a Yid comes into contact with. As we know, there's the pasuk in Mishlei, I think the pasuk is, and it is quoted in the Rambam, Bechol drachecha de'ehu. In all your ways thou shalt know him. In other words, the Rambam explains this pasuk that whatever a Yid does, all the gashmiistic things that a Yid does, everything has to be penetrated with godliness. In all what we do, we have to refer to him, to the Rabbeinu Shalom. And the stress is all what we do. In other words, all the gashmiistic inyanim have to be based on godliness, on getlichkeit. Furthermore, there's another expression which is also often quoted in Chassidus. Kol ma'asecha l'shem shamayim. All your acts, again, all, stressed all, meaning all the gashmiistic inyanim that we do. Everything has to be done for the sake of Hashem. The Rebbe explains in Siches at length what is the difference between these two approaches in Avodas Hashem. There is a difference, but he did not get into it today. But what we derive from this is that both of these expressions teach us that a Yid has to bring getlichkeit, to instill godliness in all our worldly matters, whatever we do. In other words, whatever a person does, whether it is eating, sleeping, occupation, sleep, walk, whatever he does, the Rambam lists 10 things when he quotes the pasuk of B'chol Darchecha De'eyu, which this actually includes all the general gashmiistic inyanim which a person does. All the gashmiistic inyanim which we do have to be tied in with what concept? De'ehu, to know him, to refer to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Memela, this message of the Rebbe Marash, where the Rebbe Marash is relating to us, how we have our attitude has to be such of l'katchila Rebbe. In other words, this does not apply only to spiritual matters, and does not apply only to godly matters, to ruchniistic inyanim, but even to all our gashmiistic inyanim. Our gashmis is also part of serving the Rebishter, and therefore, whatever a Yid does, this concept of l'katchila ariba has to be reflected. Based, the Rebbe continues, on the general rule of hamaisa hu ha'ika, that the main thing what counts is deed, action. Memela, now that it comes Shabbos, and we have to bring into action all these inyanim, the fact that we are going away from a day of the birthday of such outstanding person. And this is the message that he brought to us, the inyan of l'katchila ariba. Now that it comes Shabbos, we have to bring this message down into action. We know that there is a division of machshava, dibur, and maisa, which is thought, speech, and action. Rabbi continues, most inyanim of maisa, of action, are forbidden on Shabbos. Therefore, there's an expression in Chazal that dibur, speech, is also an inyan of maisa, it's also an inyan of act. Actually, there's action in speech. However, it is considered maisa zuta, a mini act. Now that we are on Shabbos, the Rebbe says, being that most action is prohibited on Shabbos, most things we're not allowed to do on Shabbos, so this puts dibur, speech, more into a position of action. In other words, what are we allowed to do on Shabbos? We're allowed to speak on Shabbos. So Mamela, now our acceptance of bringing this inyan of the Ketchila Riber into action. During the week, it'll be reflected in Maisa, it'll be reflected in action, indeed. However, now in Shabbos, what is the action that we are doing on Shabbos? That is our speech. In other words, by accepting upon ourselves, by speaking about it, and accepting upon ourselves that we will fulfill it and bring it into action during the week, this is the action, this is the deed which we are doing on Shabbos. Especially now, that it is also in the days of Sfira. And regarding Sfira, the Pasuk tells us, Usfartem lochem mimochas HaShabbos, that from the second day of Pesach, we have to count Sfira Soim. Chassidus teaches, what is the inyan of Sfira Soim? Usfartem, besides meaning to count, it also has another meaning. In Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, Even sapir would mean a diamond that shines. So what does Usfartem mean? Usfartem means by counting Sfira, we bring light, spiritual light, into these days. In other words, actually, this is the whole message of Sfira Seimer. What is the whole idea of Sfira Seimer? The idea of Sfira Seimer is that from Pesach until Shavuos, we prepare ourselves for Matan Torah. There's a famous Ran which the Rebbe quotes many occasions, that the Ran says that where does the whole custom of Sfira Seimer initiated from? It all began from the year that the Yidden left Mitzrayim. When the Yidden left Mitzrayim and they were told that after 49 days they will be given the Torah, they began counting the days. They had such a strong desire to Kabbalah Torah that they began counting days, thanking the Rebishter. Another day passed, so we are closer to Kabbalah Torah. So what is the whole union of Sfira Seimer? The whole union of Sfira Seimer is bringing spiritual light into Klal Yisrael. In other words, just like there's a shining stone, the stone glows and shines and brings light. This is the same inyan of Usfartem lachem mimochas HaShabbos. The whole idea of Sfira Seimer is also this thought, to illuminate with the spiritual light, which this is the inyan. How do we become ready to Kabbalah Torah? Also by going through the days of Sfira, by preparing ourselves. In fact, I didn't mention it today, but it's mentioned. You see this. This is why we also say every day by Sfira Seimer, every day a different midah. We begin with Chesed Shebechesed until we finally come to Malchus Shebemalchus. Why? Because the whole goal of Sfira Seimer is every person is composed of 7 major midas, and each of the 7 midas is also broken up into 7, and that is why every day we accomplish the purifying of another midah. Another midah has become already ready for Kabbalah Torah. So this is the whole inyan of Sfira Seimer. So it's extremely appropriate. Now the Rebbe is tying both of these inyanim together. The fact that the inyan which we're talking about L'Katchila Riba, that on all matters of a Yid, he should take an approach of above and beyond. And it's extremely timely that when are we talking about this in the days of Sfira? And in the days of Sfira, because this is the whole inyan of Sfira, is also to illuminate the days, to bring spiritual light into Klal Yisrael and into each and every one of us. This is the whole inyan of Sfira Seimer. Now the Rebbe says that would be extremely appropriate, being that this Farbrengen is because of the birthday of the Rebbe Marash, to relate an inyan which is discussed in the Rebbe Marash's, one of the inyanim which is discussed in the Ma'amorim of the Rebbe Marash. This is from a Maimer, begins with the pasuk Gan No'ul Be'er Mayim Chaim, which is a Maimer from the Rebbe Marash from Tafresh Mem. In fact, the Rebbe says that the Maimer is printed, and it's advisable to look up the Maimer and learn it through from the inside. The famous expression that when we look in and we see the letters in the Sefer, this adds wisdom, this adds to our understanding. Briefly, what's discussed in the Maimer is an inyan. Rabbi Marash there explains, Gan No'ul Be'er Mayim Chaim, a closed garden, Be'er Mayim Chaim, a wellspring of water. So he explains that the pasuk is referring to 2 inyan. Pasuk is referring to mitzvahs and to Torah. Gan No'ul, a locked closed garden, refers to the inyan of mitzvahs. Then he ties it in also to the famous expression which we use in davening. Kachenu b'mitzveisecha, v'sein chelkeinu b'seirasecha. First there's an inyan, sanctify us with your mitzvahs. That's first. Then comes v'sein chelkeinu b'seirasecha, give us your share in our Torah, give us our share in your Torah. Be'el mayim chayim, what is the meaning of a well of water, of live water, of spring water? This has a shaykhus to Torah, because Torah we know is compared to water. Famous Chazal that just like water flows from high down, the same thing Torah came in Makam Gavaya from very high, Makam Navach came down to us. So there is the inyan of Kachenu b'mitzveisecha, v'sein chelkeinu b'seirasecha in general. But also continue that Rabbi Marash in that Maimel explains it, that we have it specifically also in the Aveda, in our daily task. We also have both in Yonim. We have to have the inyan of Kachena b'mitzvah when we wake up in the morning and we do mitzvahs. Then there's also an inyan which every Yid has to do every day. V'sein chalkeinu b'seirasecha, give us our share in your Torah. In other words, both in Yonim are required from a Yid. The Yid is required to excel in the inyan of Kiyum HaMitzvahs, and as well as in the inyan of Limud HaTorah. In the second Sikha, Rabbi began, this as he spoke about it a few weeks ago, there's a question regarding Moshe Rabbeinu. Regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, what status did Moshe have? Did he have a status of a Kohen, or a Kohen Gadol, or neither? We have a Rashi, a few weeks ago the Rebbe spoke this Rashi, that in the days when the Mishkan was dedicated, the Yemei HaMiluyim, we find that Rashi tells us that those days Moshe was actively involved in the Avodah in the Mishkan. And what type of garment did Moshe wear? So Rashi tells us there that Shimesh Bechaluk Lovam. What did he wear? He wore a simple white shirt. So obviously this is not the Big Day Kahuna. It seems like he wore a different type of wardrobe. He wore something else. Simple. What Rebbe explained a few weeks ago why he wore this simple uniform of only a simple white shirt. But again, we know that as far as a Kohen, and even a Kohen Gadol, we know that the Kohen Gadol has 8 types of garments, a regular Kohen has 4 types of garments. Regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, the question arises, what type of garment, what type of status did he have? And if we look in Chazal, we find several types of expressions. There's one expression, Moshe Shimish B'Kahuna Gedolah, that Moshe had a status of a Kohen Gadol. We have other expressions which ignore that. What I'm looking for is a Rashi which the Rebbe mentioned, that when Moshe was chosen from the Rebishter to go and take the Yidden out of Mitzrayim, and Moshe initially refused. Moshe was not welcoming right away the suggestion which the Rebishter gave him. So the pasuk uses the expression Vayichar af Hashem b'Moshe, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was angry in Moshe. Vayichar af Hashem b'Moshe, it's a pasuk in Shmois, that the Rebishter was angry on Moshe, and he told him, Vayoyim, and the Rebishter says, Halay Aaron achicha halevi, Aaron your brother the Levi, Yadaiti kidabe yadabehu, I know that he's going to talk. In other words, Moshe complained that he cannot speak clear, that he stutters while he speaks. So the Rebishter says, I know Aaron is going to help you, and he's not going to mind that I have appointed you. Vegam hinehu yetzel l'chasecha, he's even going to come out towards you and greet you. V'ra'acha v'samach b'liba, he will see you and he will be happy. So the Rebishter is convincing Moshe Rabbeinu that he should accept upon himself this mission and go out and take the Yidden out of Mitzrayim. If we look into Rashi, here in Shmois, Rashi quotes a Gemara in Zvachim. Gemara says, Rabbi Shua ben Korcha Oima. Rabbi Shua ben Korcha says, Kol charoin afshe b'toira nema b'roishim. Wherever there's an expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was angry, there was always something left over from this anger. In other words, it left an impression. There was something that remained as a result of the anger. It had an effect. However, this one is an exception. This is the opinion of Rabbi Shua ben Korcha. Amale Rabbi Yosi, so Rabbi Yosi tells him, Af bezunam abayroishim. There is an effect which was left over from this anger as well. And what does he explain? Halay Aaron achicha halevi. The pasuk uses the expression Aaron the Levi. So Yosi says, Shahaya asid liyos Levi v'loikoi. Originally, Aaron was supposed to be a Levi and not a Kohen. And you, Moshe, were worthy of being a Kohen. Now that he angered HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lo yeh Kohen, it will not be that way. Elohu yeh Kohen, but he will be a Kohen. Ve'ata Levi, and you, Moshe, will be only a Levi. Shenema, he quotes a pasuk, Moshe ish Elokim, ban of Yikoru al Shevet HaLevi, a pasuk in Divrei Hayom. What do we see from this? Actually, the Rebbe says, what is the machlokes between Rabbi Shua ben Korcha and Rabbi Yosi? Rabbi Yosi learns that Moshe initially would have been a Kohen, and it is because of this getting HaKadosh Baruch Hu angry that he lost the Kehunah and wound up only with Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, who claims that there was no effect from this anger, no eternal effect left over from this anger, obviously he's not getting involved into this whether Moshe had the status of a Kohen or a Levi. So it could be that he learns that Moshe remained with the status of a Kohen and Moshe did not lose it. The Rebbe continued, we find regarding the Mishkan, we find that the Rambam tells us, when the Rambam in the halachas of Beis HaBchira and the halachas of Beis HaMikdash, Rambam tells us that the main inyan, why HaKadosh Baruch Hu has said to build the Beis HaMikdash, and the Rambam says the same applies to the Mishkan, and to the first Beis HaMikdash, and to the second Beis HaMikdash, and to the Beis HaMikdash which we will get, b'mheira v'yameinu. What is the main inyan of the Beis HaMikdash is korbanos. The fact that we will makrif korbanos in the Beis HaMikdash to the Eibush. Now, Rebbe says, if we look through the psukim of Chumash carefully, we will notice that the Oyel Moyed, which was in the Mishkan, served another purpose. Pasuk uses the expression that V'ne'adati l'cha shama. The Rebishter says he will meet with Moshe Rabbeinu. Where was the place where the Rebishter conversed with Moshe? Where did the Rebishter tell Moshe all the messages to relate to Klal Yisrael? Where did all this happen? Obviously, this all took place in the Oyel Moed. Oyel Moed, which was part of the Mishkan. So the question arises, when the Rambam tells us that the main inyan of the Mishkan was the fact that korbanos were brought there, why does he totally ignore the fact that this is the place where Moshe Rabbeinu and the Rebishter met at all times, and this was the spot where all the messages which Moshe Rabbeinu got from the Rebishter to relate to Klal Yisrael were all given in the Oyel Moed. So the Oyel Moed was not only, which was the part of the Mishkan, was not only for korbanos, but it was served another purpose. It served the purpose that this is where the Rebishter has related all the messages to Bnei Yisrael, channeled through Moshe Rabbeinu, was also at Oyel Moed. The Rebbe explains, goes a step further. Another thing, we are discussing what was the status of Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Did he have a status of a Kohen, a regular Kohen, or a Kohen Gadol, or neither? We know that whenever we refer to Aaron, we always refer to him Aaron HaKohen. To Moshe, how do we always refer to? Moshe Rabbeinu. It's unusual that we should refer to him Moshe HaKohen. According to those that claim that he had the status of a Kohen as well, or even the status of a Kohen Gadol, still, we never find in Svarim or in Chazal or anywhere that what should be Moshe Rabbeinu's title, Moshe HaKohen, always with the title of Rabbeinu. The truth is, the Rebbe says, naturally Rabbeinu is a greater title. Rabbeinu means he is each and every one of ours Rebbe. It's an unusual title. A person that Klal Yisrael for all generations, we refer to him that he is our Rebbe, he's our teacher. But on the other hand, if he would have possessed the title of Kehuna, why, at least occasionally, we should refer to him as a Kohen as well? The Rebbe is learning the reason why the Rambam ignores the fact that Moshe always was speaking to the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Mishkan, in the Oyel Moed, which was in the Mishkan. The Rambam only discusses the Indian of the Karbanis, which were brought in the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash later, is because even before the Mishkan was erected, Moshe still communicated with the Rebbeinu. From where? From an Oyel, from a tent. But it seems that the tent initially was somewhere in Moshe's house, or near Moshe's house, a part of Moshe's house. And later, once the Mishkan was erected, this Oyel, or whatever Moshe would utilize the tent near his house for, was no longer practiced in a separate tent, but it came from where? From the Mishkan. The Rambam only tells us new accomplishments which the Mishkan introduced. That the Mishkan introduced the fact that a Yid has a spot where to bring korbanos. The Rambam does not tell us everything which happened in the Mishkan, especially something which was going on before the Mishkan was erected, which is the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was communicating with the Rebbeinu. Moshe's communication with the Rebbeinu was going on even before. Memela, there's no need for the Rambam to mention it when the Rambam is discussing the Indian of the Mishkan, excuse me, and what was accomplished in the Mishkan, and what was introduced in the Mishkan, because this was something which was going on from before. Memela, when Moshe Rabbeinu entered into the Mishkan, what did Moshe go for? He went to get messages from the Rebbeinu to relate to Klal Yisrael. All the mitzvahs and all of Torah, everything came through Moshe, which he heard from the Rebbeinu in the Oyel or in the Oyel Moed. Now the Rebbe says when Moshe Rabbeinu went in there, Moshe was there's a Sifri which tells us at length how Moshe was able to speak and communicate with the Rebbeinu at all times. Aaron HaKohen was not allowed to enter at all times. B'zois Yavei Aaron, there's a pasuk only with special rules and regulations when Aaron was permitted to enter the Kodesh. However, Moshe was permitted, he had access to the Rebbeinu at all times. Something unusual. There was nobody else in the caliber of Moshe Rabbeinu that could communicate with the Rebbeinu whenever he wanted. When Moshe entered the Beis HaMikdash, the Mishkan, could be that when he entered the Mishkan, he did certain avodas in the Mishkan. Now, can we compare the avodas he did to the Mishkan to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu had constant access to the Rebbeinu, and the Rebbeinu was communicating with him, and the Rebbeinu related all of the mitzvahs through Moshe? So naturally, we refer to him as Moshe Rabbeinu. Because the title Moshe Rabbeinu is by far a yet greater title than any other title we could think. This is a meiradika title. This stresses the fact how Moshe was able to approach the Rebbeinu at any time and get a response from the Rebbeinu, and he knew what to relate to Klal Yisrael by any matter which at any time aroused. And Moshe had an answer right away directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Question only remains, the Rebbe says, Moshe Rabbeinu himself. He was the one that related Torah to Klal Yisrael. He received Torah from the Rebbeinu, the Oyel Moed. Each and every time he wanted, he spoke to the Rebbeinu. So he was the first one that had access to Torah. Why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu himself clarify this matter regarding his own self?
We have contradictory expressions in Chazal and in Medrash. What was Moshe's status? Whether it was a status of a Kohen Gadol, or of a regular Kohen, or perhaps not a Kohen at all. Moshe himself, there was no one closer to Torah than Moshe. Moshe himself could have definitely found a solution regarding his own status as well, and put this into Torah so that we will have a solution and know what was Moshe's own status. This question, the Rebbe says, remains to be answered. Another question which he brought up is what will be Moshe's status la'asad lovei, when Mashiach will come. When Mashiach will come, Moshe and Aaron, everybody's going to be there again. Famous expression of Chazal, Moshe va'Aaron in Mohem, that Moshe, everybody's going to, Rebbe is going to bring back life to everyone, Tchias HaMeisim, and Moshe and Aaron are going to be there. What will be Moshe and Aaron's status then? Mashiach will be the one that is going to teach everyone Torah. Mashiach is going to teach Torah to Klal Yisrael. This is what Chazal tell us. But what kind of a status will Moshe Rabbeinu have when Mashiach will come? Will he have status of a Kohen Gadol, or maybe neither? And again, this question also remains to be answered. Now, going into the regular inyanim which are discussed in the Shabbos to Farbrengen, today the Rebbe raised a question in a Rashi in Parshas Metzora. It is in Kapitel Yud Daled, Pasuk Mem Aleph, Pasuk 41 in Kapitel Yud Daled, in Parshas Metzora. Pasuk uses the expression Ves habayis yaktzia mi bayis soviv. It's talking about a plague which was seen in a house. The pasuk uses the expression, in the house he shall cause to be scraped from within. If we look into Rashi is trying to explain the word yaktzia. Rashi is quoting a word balaz, which is an often practice in Rashi, which means that Rashi wants that the child who's learning Chumash should understand it, should understand the Chumash which is being learned. And Rashi obviously did not have a word in Hebrew which will be easy for the child to understand and know what the word means. So Rashi, that's why at many occasions, it's page 138. Page 138. Oh. Okay, it's Kapitel Yud Daled, Mem Aleph. But Rashi does not satisfy himself with this. And Rashi goes ahead and adds a few more words. Ubeloshin Mishnah yesh harbe. And in the language of Mishnah, this term is used in many instances. Why does Rashi tell us here about Loshen Mishnah? We're learning Chumash, right? We're learning Chumash, and there's a word yaktzia, which means to be scraped, but Rashi did not have a suitable Hebrew word briefly to be able to explain it to the child. So what does Rashi do? Rashi uses a word in a foreign language, which children in Rashi's country, where Rashi lived at the time, understood what these words meant. Why does Rashi have to mention Ubeloshen Mishnah yesh harbe, that there's many such expressions in Loshen Mishnah? We're not learning Mishnah now. What does this help us to understand the pasuk? When the Rebbe is learning Pshat in this Rashi, that the idea of Rashi is, Rashi always wants to make it easier on the child. Easier on the child, so that the child who's learning Chumash should understand what the words mean. And that is why he does bring in words from different languages, so the people in the country that he lived in, the children in that country, should understand what the word means. Now, the way it was set up in times of Chazal, it was a ben Chamesh lemikra and ben Eser lemishnah. Later generations, the way this educational system was set up, they no longer waited for a child to reach 10 years old that he should begin learning Mishnah. Child began learning Mishnah even at an early age, and this is how it is today as well. Even the child who is 5 years old and is learning Chumash, and perhaps he's not learning Mishnah yet, but he's definitely aware of Mishnah. What Rashi is trying to do is Rashi is trying to make it as easy as possible for the child to understand the Pshat and the Chumash. Therefore, what Rashi is doing is, he's telling you, I don't have that identical word, what to tell you in Hebrew to translate what Yaktsiya means. That's why I'm using a balaz, which is in a foreign language. However, Rashi is telling the child, you should know that when you will be learning Mishnah, you will have this word many times. In other words, it's not a total strange word. It's not a one-time word which is used once and it will never be used again. You should know that in Mishnah you will have this word many times. In other words, Rashi is trying to make it easy on the child. The child should not think that this is a word which will never be used. It's used one time, will never be used again. Child, kinmais, in other words, you are learning, youngster, you should know, you will come across this word, and the word is used often. The expression of Mishnah. There's many such expressions. The word yaktsiya. Therefore, in other words, what the Rebbe is trying to say, why does Rashi bring also that Mishnah, this expression is used often? This is like to make it easier on the child. Don't think that this is an outdated word which will never be used again. You'll learn Mishnah, you will have this word many times. Here in Chumash, it may not be a popular word, but in Mishnah the word will be used many times. So therefore the child already knows that this is a word which is used. It may not be used in Chumash, but it's used in Mishnah. It's customary in the Farbrengens, in the summer Farbrengens, the Rebbe discusses a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. And today he discussed the Mishnah in Perek Beis. In the second Perek. In the second Perek, Mishnah tells us, Hu haya aimer. He would often say, I think it's Rabbi Gamliel, what Mishnah I think it is. Yes. Hu haya aimer, Rabbi Gamliel. Asei retzoinoi kirtzoincha. Make your will like his will. Kedei sheyase retzoincha kirtzoinoi. So he, the Rabbeinu Shalom, will make your will like his will. Then the Mishnah continues. Batel retzoincha mipnei retzoinoi. Put aside your will for his will. So the Rebbeinu will reward you and he will put aside the will of others because of you to satisfy your will. The Rebbe always stresses how Pirkei Avos is Mila de Chasidusa. In other words, it's advices of acts above and beyond what we are required to do al pi halach. In other words, in yonim of lifnim mishuras hadin, more than the halachic requirement. So let us think a moment. What does this Mishnah say? That we have to create our will. Asei retzoinoi kirtzoincha. Make your will like his will. What does this actually mean, in essence? Do mitzvahs. Is this something of Mila de Chasidusa? This is the basic of the entire Torah. The basis of the entire Torah is that our will should be like the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what? And learn Torah and do mitzvahs. Furthermore, we just learned a week ago in last week's Perek how we are supposed to do all of the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs and not to seek for a reward. What are we told here? Make his will like your will. So what will be? So the Rebishter will fulfill your wish, your will. So immediately we are told about a reward. We were just taught a week ago in last week's Perek not to seek for rewards. And here we are told about rewards. The Rebbe is learning. The Mishnah here is not talking about the mere fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs. Mishnah here is talking about a higher level. Meaning, a person could be at times fulfilling mitzvahs, learning Torah and fulfilling mitzvahs. However, it is lacking his rotzain. His rotzain, his desire is not there. As far as the fulfillment of the mitzvahs, as far as doing the mitzvahs, he has done the mitzvahs perfectly. The mitzvahs he did. However, dedication, what is rotzain? Will means dedication. His dedication, this is what's lacking. And the Mishnah is talking about such a level. And this is what the Mishnah is referring to. Here the Rebbe elaborated on it. In fact, it could be seen in a yet higher level. This is what the Alter Rebbe talks about in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya explains what's the inyan of a Beinani. Alter Rebbe there explains us that a Beinani is a person who is fulfilling all Torah mitzvahs perfectly. However, he did not destroy all of the evil that is within him. Meaning within him he still has evil and may get a desire and a request, a temptation to do an Aveira. However, in reality he will not do it. So the Rotzain is there. The Rotzain, the will, the wish to do something evil, to do something wrong is there. And on the other hand, we're talking about a person who's classified as a Beinani of Tanya. A Beinani of Tanya is a person who is, as far as deed goes, as far as action goes, he's not done anything wrong. So in other words, it is possible for a person to learn Torah and fulfill mitzvahs, be committed to all the mitzvahs. However, when we're talking about the Ratzon, when we're talking about desire, his inner will, his inner desire, his koiches pnimim, his inner koiches, his inner strength, there something could be lacking. And this is what the Mishnah is talking about. So the Mishnah Taka is not talking about the first level commitment of fulfilling Torah mitzvahs. This is something which Pirkei Avos doesn't have to tell us. This is something which we know from Torah that we have to do. Pirkei Avos is demanding yet something more than that. Pirkei Avos is demanding how a person has to commit not only his action and his deeds, that all his mindset, but also that his will and his desire, all of his inner koiches, all of his whatever he possesses, everything has to be dedicated to the Rabbeinu Shalom. Talking on this inyan, the Rebbe also brought out that there is a concept of sheichad. Sheichad means bribery. What means bribe? Let us look into the pasuk. Pasuk tells us, "Hasheichad ya'aver einei tzadikim, einei chachamim." Sheichad, bribe, makes blind the eyes of those who are smart, the wisdom, the wise. V'yisalef divrei tzadikim, and it turns around the words of the tzadikim. So bribe is something. It does something outstanding that it can accomplish. It does. The person who has taken bribe, who was bribed, and he's coming out with a wrong opinion. Rabbi says, he does not know that he's saying anything wrong al pi Torah. He's under the impression that in accordance to Torah he is saying the perfect and right thing. Would he know he's saying something wrong, then he would definitely retract. V'yisalef divrei tzadikim. What it does is it takes the words of the righteous, the words of tzadikim, and it has such a power that it turns it around. It's fadreitos. It says there are those people who, because of through bribe, comes to major matters. The Rebbe said, come to a matter of mir Yehudi, Giyuk ha'alocha. Says they're going to say contrary to Torah. Why can't they come to such a position? It is all because they took sheichat, and they are under the impression that what they are saying is the opinion of Torah. And with sheichat can have such an effect that the person can think that he's under the led and guided by Torah, and in accordance to Torah, he thinks that he says that there's no need to correct, to amend the law of return, and that there's no need to amend, that only Gio Ka'alocha can be recognized in Eretz Yisrael. Or the same thing, on other similar matters, the Rebbe says a person who is at the head of a yeshiva, and he's going to think that he can have a saying regarding financial matters of that yeshiva. How can he give an honest opinion about his own yeshiva when we're talking about his own yeshiva's financial matters? It's definite that the opinion cannot be a clear and honest one. And we're talking about people who the Torah refers to. Torah says that they are chachamim, they are tzaddikim, and still at the same time it is ya'aver, it makes them blind. The thing is there, but they cannot see it. They cannot. What is the pshat when somebody's Rahman al-Islam blind? Person is blind means he cannot see an object which is in front of him. He just does not see it. The same thing, a person who has taken bribe, he may be the greatest Talmid Chacham. He just cannot have the proper view to be able to evaluate a matter in accordance to Torah. And he definitely thinks that he is saying it in accordance to Torah. But the truth is, it cannot work. It just can't work both ways. Another inyan which the Rebbe explained today is in the inyan of Limud HaRambam. Today it's the halachas of Yibum. Yibum Echlitze. Yibum Echlitze means that if a person dies, let us assume if somebody by the name of Ruvain dies, and Ruvain did not leave any children, so min haTorah, his wife is supposed to marry her brother-in-law. In other words, her husband's brother. This is what is called Yibum. It's a mitzvah in the Torah. If for whatever reason she's not marrying him, then there is an inyan of chalitza. Chalitza is a special procedure of which is done in a Jewish court, which this releases the woman from her brother-in-law. It's a special shoe which has to be worn. It's called a chalitza shoe. A whole system which Rabbanim, which the Rav had to process, which is called Yibum. I'm sorry, thank you, chalitza. Nowadays, Yibum is not practiced, but in an event when something like this Rahman al-Islam happens, then what is done is chalitza. Now in the Rambam it is discussed. There's one other thing which we have to mention. Normally, a woman is not allowed to marry her husband's brother. As the halachas are in the Torah, she is prohibited from marrying her husband's brother. However, in such a case where her husband dies and does not leave any children, this is an exception where the Torah has approved, not only has approved, but where the Torah says it is a mitzvah for the next brother in line. The mitzvah is always on the oldest. For the next brother in line to marry his brother's wife, in other words, his sister. In the Rambam, where the Rambam discusses it, the Rambam pushes strong the inyan of Yibum. And the Rambam explains that even though he may not have the fullest intention for the mitzvah, in other words, he may have side thoughts that he wants to marry his sister-in-law, Rambam says still he's doing the mitzvah and he should go ahead and do it. And Halach and Shulchan Aruch, the Poskim in Even Ezer, do not pasken so. And in Shulchan Aruch they pasken that nowadays we stay away from Yibum, and what we do is chalitza in case such a situation arises, being that he may not marry her fully l'shem mitzvah. In other words, he may have, as we just mentioned, side intentions as well, because he just, for the sake of marrying her, not only for the fact that the Torah has said that this is the case that he has to marry her. So Mamela and Shulchan Aruch, it is paskin today that there is no concept of yibum. What is done is chalitza. Actually, the Rebbe says this difference of opinion between the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch can be understood with another difference of an opinion, which we also have, which as we can explain it, it is a difference between Sfardim and Ashkenazim. And that is the fact of not marrying more than one wife. By Sephardim, it is something which is not accepted as by Ashkenazim. Sephardim do marry more than one wife. However, Ashkenazim strictly adhere to the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom, which Rabbeinu Gershom has instituted, that where he prohibits a person to marry more than one woman. And not only that, but to the extent that by Ashkenazim it is accepted that if one wants to, in other words, release himself from his marriage, it has to go, and for whatever reason a divorce cannot be given, then a concept of heter meir rabbonim comes into the situation. Heter meir rabbonim means that this individual, on this particular case, gets permission from 100 rabbonim, 100 people who are considered rabbonim, approve of the fact that he can marry an additional woman. In other words, why is he marrying an additional woman? It is because the first one is not in a position of accepting a divorce, or for whatever reason she doesn't accept a divorce. Naturally, these matters cannot be handled by people on their own. When a question like this comes up, it has to be handled by authentic rabbanim. But again, this concept of Heta Meir Rabbanim shows us how severe the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom is. So what do we see from here? We have two differences between Sfardim and Ashkenazi. First, we see that the Sfardim are more lenient in the fact of Yibum, that they do go through Yibum, marrying the brother-in-law. Also, we see that the Sfardim are more lenient when it comes to having more than one wife. And Ashkenazim are more strict in both of these matters. The Rebbe explained it very briefly, but what he said was something very interesting. He says perhaps it could be understood with that the Golesen, the exiles which the Sephardic Yidden are in, and opposed to the exile which we Ashkenazim are in. We Ashkenazim are in the Goles of Edom, the Goles of Esav of Edom. The Sephardim are in the Goles by Yishmael. Regarding Avodah Zarah, we find something very interesting. The Rambam tells us that the Avodah Zarah, the worshipping of Muhammad, the Rambam says that is not an inyan of Avodah Zarah. Naturally, it is not advisable, but at the same time, those that worship it are not considered worshipping Avodah Zarah. The Rambam explains it. However, the Rambam says, regarding Christianity, this is definitely an inyan of Avodah Zarah. What does this show us? This shows us, in other words, what do we derive from this? We derive from this that as far as the exiles, the level of Golus, or the severeness of Golus which we Ashkenazim have, is a much stronger Golus than the Golus which the Sfardim have. Therefore, when it came to making Gezeres, limitations and boundaries on Yidden and Golus, so the limitations on Ashkenazim turned out to be much more strict, much more severe than as opposed to the limitations which were made on those Yidden which were in the Arabic Golus. That is why it is reflected even in halachas that for them not such severe, not such strict gezeres were made as the gezeres which were made for the Ashkenazi Yidden which are in Golas by Esav, in Golas by Edom. Another inyan which the Rebbe explained, it's an outcome of explanation in the Zohar, which he explained today. We stressed very strongly the inyan of Avas Yisrael, and also very strong against the inyan of Marash Chayra. Marash Chayra meaning a person that falls into a mood of sadness. Rebbe portrayed it of an individual that goes to one doctor and he's told by the doctor everything is okay. Goes to the second doctor, he also tells him it's okay. And the third doctor tells him that his condition is okay. And still the person is not happy. He's looking for another doctor. Still not satisfied. Why is this? Because he has Marash Chayra. In other words, he has something of leading him into sadness within himself. And therefore, even when he turns to his Asay Lecha Rav, and his Rav tells him that everything is okay, so still he goes ahead and thinks kapaya, he thinks the opposite. It still doesn't satisfy him. And it causes aggravation for himself, it causes aggravation for his family. However, would he be listening to his Rav? And here, the Rebbe spoke about this, he again spoke about the importance of Asay Lecha Rav. And listening to what the Rav tells us, then he would do away with a lot of unwanted things which just are there to cause grievance and cause agmas nefesh. However, if he would listen to his Rav, he wouldn't come to it. But also reminded about preparing properly for Lag Baimer. This week, 2 letters came out from the Rebbe, one addressed to children and one addressed to the people who are educating children, where the Rebbe is demanding that the day of Lag Baimer be utilized properly by making ta'aluchos, parades, and so forth, which will lead to a Kiddush Hashem. And today the Rebbe urged again on the importance of this, and especially the day of Rab Shimon ben Yochai, which this is Lag Baimer. And there's a Gemara, the Gemara tells us that Rab Shimon ben Yochai said that he yechilna lifter sa'ela min adin. He can bring schus to the entire world, bring merit to the entire world, and take away din, take away judgment from the world. The Rebbe also mentioned that there's a word related from Reb Zalman Zezmer, who was a chassid from the Alter Rebbe, in behalf of the Alter Rebbe, that he expressed himself that Reb Shimon ben Yochai lived at a madrege higher than Churban. In other words, he was not affected by the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash. So this is the day of Lag Baimer, so what kind of an outstanding day it is. Therefore, it is most appropriate to make sure that this day is utilized by everyone, and particularly for children.